So my name is Ijoma Okpanum. I'm a lecturer at University of Aberdeen, and I will be chairing this session. So with me are Professor Katie Hampton, Professor Mia Perry, and Professor Judy Robinson. Okay, so far the conversations have kind of evolved from gender gaps to promoting excellence in research. So we're going to conclude by looking at best practices, especially in terms of Africa-Europe partnerships and collaborations. Okay. So reflecting on the questions that you have, a starting point would be on equity in partnerships, okay? So I'm going to ask you a question about what you think equity means. I think from my perspective, I would say equity is beyond tokenism. So having that in mind is also beyond just systemic inclusion. So most research, let's say most partnerships, Africa-Europe partnerships, African researchers are seen as a token. Let's add them to this research because it's a requirement. So bearing that in mind, how can African European partners design a more collaborative and fair distribution of leadership, funding, and authorship when collaborating?
Do you want to start? Okay, well, first of all, I just want to also address a bit of a disparity here in that there's 3 women professors who are clearly, well, I don't know actually, but I'm certainly not African. So I feel a bit uncomfortable speaking in terms of knowing what might be best in terms of equitable partnership, but I can speak from my experience with long-term collaborations with African partners. And it's not an easy question to answer because I feel like structurally the whole world is kind of stacked with a very imbalanced, inequitable situation. And I work on a disease of poverty. I feel like I should know what inequities are, and I looked it up before the panel to kind of make sure I was really thinking about the right thing. And, you know, I was definitely thinking about fairness and justice, but really about trying to redress the disparities that have gone on for so long. And we were tasked, I think, in terms of funding and authorship as a couple of specific examples. And one thing that is strikingly clear in terms of grants is the imbalance of the money that goes to the different institutions, and the overheads from the UK perspective are just startling. And once you've kind of factored in the overheads and maybe you've tried to put money towards one person from the UK side, suddenly there's like hardly any budget left. So I've certainly tried to take opportunities where we've been able to actually make the largest subcontract to our overseas partner, which I guess is a step in the right direction, but we also need to make a very strong case institutionally and to the funders as to why that imbalance in particular shouldn't exist, especially when I'm working on, for example, a disease that circulates in particular African communities. That's where the work is happening, and the money needs to be actually in the place where the work is happening and where potentially voices there have the biggest opportunity to spark and push through change.
Thank you. We might be able to be pretty succinct because Katie and Jude and I all work together in different ways, and I think we might be able to, I agree with everything Katie said, and I'll speak about another part of the question that's not the economic part, which is hugely, hugely important. And I suppose I'll take the opportunity to speak about, I do a lot of work in equitable partnerships. And I think I would like to just preface this by saying when we talk about the northern partnerships, those are repeated in all sorts of different contexts. So looking at equity and partnerships within Africa or within a global South and South partnership has a lot of similarities with looking at ethical partnerships in general terms with North and South, for example. And I would say in practical terms, there's something really, really important about the level of transparency that people are comfortable with that comes together with moving towards equity, a sort of owning your own baggage, if I say that without the swear word. And that's really difficult to do, I think, when we're in a very hierarchied structure like academia. So a transparency, a self-reflexivity and a positionality in all sorts of the dynamics that we might bring together, that whether that's across a global North-South context or two different disciplines, career stages, gender stages. There are hierarchies that we're always entangled in, and a practical practice that I found is really powerful within that is simply about owning your own, understanding your own position in that, and attempting transparency. And Katie talked about budget, and I can't tell you how uncommon it is to share the budget. Just to look at those figures and how many of our northern partners will share the overhead ratio with their southern partners. It's really rare. So just simple things like transparency and reflexivity would take us a huge way forward from where the dominant paradigm models are currently situated.
Yeah, so I absolutely agree with what's been said, and so my contribution will hopefully build on that a little bit to look at sort of inequalities within as well. So, I mean, we can talk about sort of power sharing between people even in the global north, because, traditionally female academics, as colleagues here have said, have not had equal access to resources or to prestige or to opportunities to travel, to make their research visible in the same way perhaps as male colleagues. And that's something that is an ongoing battle, I think, in many institutions. And as colleagues have pointed out, that can be far more exacerbated in STEM subjects than some arts, humanities and social sciences, but not uniquely. And I think as well, when we are thinking about partnerships with colleagues in other countries, particularly countries in Africa where all of us work, there's also inequalities there. Who is our African colleague? Our African colleague might actually be quite a very privileged African colleague, and they might actually have, not be necessarily aware of their own privilege and positionality. And so I think when we're thinking about what we mean by equity, I think we need to be able to advocate for people who aren't even present. So I can remember a large grant that I was a co-I on some time ago under the Global Challenges Research Fund. There were just simply no women present for our African partners. Every institution that we partnered with had forwarded a very senior, very excellent male colleague. And how do we counter that? How can we challenge very, very deeply embedded norms as well, without then causing offence as well to the colleague who is there, and saying, come on, there must be some women in your institution who could be here, but does that effectively then push them out? So I think what we need are these very open conversations where we can actually, at a very early stage, and I think this is what we all like, isn't it? If we could talk about research at the beginning, not when things are nailed down, not when the finances are nailed down, not when the ideas are nailed down, so we can respond to different priorities and make sure that everyone's priorities are represented. But then we can also have those conversations about what does equity mean to them, as well potentially as to everybody around the table, what does equity mean? And how do we all maybe need to shift a little to allow for other presences?
Thank you very much for that. I think one key point or takeaway from the discussion so far is equity should be about intellectual contribution, not just about the person who looks best on CV or the person who maybe gender-wise, maybe male, female. So yes, thank you for that. Moving on, based on your experience, can you share an example of a successful Africa-Europe partnership or collaboration? A very effective one.
I'll just share one that I'm particularly proud of recently because I'm just amazed at the leadership of my colleagues in Tanzania, who I've known for a long time. And one of the I mean, you mentioned it briefly, that the difficulty of navigating different levels of expertise, and like, for me, I have kind of progressed in my academic career, and I've mentored a number of Tanzanian PhD students, and the closest I had to a academic Tanzanian mentor passed away a few years back. So we were kind of, whilst there was really excellent institutional leaders, there was not the kind of disciplinary expertise that this particular guy had been a real sort of a real leader on. So the grant that we were able to secure with funding from the UK MRC programme in global health was actually largely made up of Tanzanians, and they were driving practical and policy changes in Tanzania and was requiring their expertise, their epidemiological expertise, but an awful lot about navigating the relationships between practice and policy making, and areas that I would say we're not trained in as scientists very well. And so we've ended up collaborating in an awful lot of remote situations, but they have taken forward the real practical work, and it's just been a really amazing experience seeing these are former PhD students or people that I've mentored in some capacity, and now they're really the leaders of that work. And actually, I think probably one of the key, most important things to the success has been in these negotiations within policy circles in Tanzania that has not been a white face in the room trying to negotiate things, and their own expertise has been really recognised by their national government partners.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk about the Sustainable Futures Global Network, which is the sort of most hopeful and successful initiative that I've been part of in looking at equitable partnerships for international collaboration. And very briefly, it's a network like this network, and it started out in very similar way, very similar size. But it was initially funded by Global Challenges Research funding from the UK. And we began about 10 years ago now with a resolution that if we were going to use that kind of funding, and if we were going to endeavour on international development-related collaborations, that we were going to try and do it a bit differently. That we look back on 70, 100 years of international development, recognised the situation we had found ourselves in 10 years ago, which was a huge imbalance of a huge amount of epistemic injustice, a world on the verge, on the brink of all sorts of crises 10 years ago, much worse now. And we thought, let's not try to fix the house with the tools that broke it, basically. So it's a network that we go to, and it's now a couple of hundred people. Predominantly, the hubs are in sub-Saharan Africa, but we also have hubs around the world. So the leadership in terms of numbers, project foci, paradigms come from sub-Saharan Africa predominantly. But what we had to do to help that network proceed and flourish beyond the systematic and the infrastructural restrictions, let's say, is make it a social enterprise. So we functioned as a sort of informal network for many years, but it was too difficult to navigate the kind of restrictions that Katie alluded to with budgeting, with the multiple objectives and very often conflicting objectives of a higher education institution in the Global North, and the needs and challenges in the Southern partners that were leading the work, that we had to sort of move away from the formal sector and become an independent organisation. So that's a sort of a living experiment, a living lab, if you like. And if I would just do it in one sentence rather than 5 minutes, it's underpinned by a notion of ethical partnerships and a real strong commitment of trying to figure out what that looks like every day differently, because we're working in different contexts with different people all the time, but trying to imagine different ways of doing things, because our current practices aren't working. You know, we're still here today, still drinking the same coffee and, you know, doing the same kind of thing, but we haven't obviously solved anything. In fact, things have been getting worse for the communities that we work with. And so we're a network that tries to figure out new models and practices.
I'm just going to come in with another success story around people and relationships. So I think you can go into a research setting, sometimes as a member of a team, and people you first meet, you actually just don't know them. And I think, one of the things that I'm very committed to when I'm involved in the design of a grant is to think about all of the places where we can do informal learning as well as formal learning. So sometimes we're very good at having these opportunities for people to do training or development, and it's all very formalised. But actually just getting people together in a room, maybe sharing food or having breakfast together, looking at people's papers with them looking at your work as well and reflecting, and having lots of other times when you're perhaps even just doing a walking tour of a space, a neighbourhood, an unfamiliar place that will maybe is unfamiliar to all of us, and we're all having that shared knowledge and shared understanding. And I think that's when a lot of the learning takes place. And so I think just reflecting on actually perhaps the large GROW project, GCRF project that I was part of, there were lots of opportunities for shared learning there, informal shared learning. And I think what I take away from that is the fact that if I looked at my WhatsApp message list now, there would be 2 or 3 messages from colleagues. They're either telling me that they've published their paper or they're moving institutions. They're doing something amazing somewhere. And hopefully, you know, obviously if I'm doing something, I'll be sharing it with them too. And some of this is stuff we've done together. It's other stuff they've done independently. But what we've actually created, I think, is a very meaningful research community that's gone on to do more.
Thank you. I 100% agree with you. And just building on the comment you made now, I haven't had a lot of successful Africa-Europe research collaboration. However, I've had an Asia-Europe collaboration. Perhaps there are lessons to learn from that as well, which is applicable to the context that we're discussing. But what made that project very successful was we focused on capacity exchange rather than capacity transfer, where we had to kind of transfer the Western ideologies to them. So those local universities provided the contextual expertise that we needed, while we, as the European University, provided complementary resources for them. So that was what made it very successful. And also we focused on building relationships. That's why I said I agree with you, because we focused on trust building. So from the onset, our first point of call was to have a face-to-face inception meeting to break the ice, where we got to know everybody, and then we meet up for coffee, tea, we just talk to each other just to build trust. And 4 years down the line, we still have our group chat still functional, and we still send messages, exchange, and we're still collaborating on many projects now. So yes, that is a very valuable point, so thank you for that. So moving on to the next question. How can collaborations move from one directional to true co-creation and mutual learning?
Do you mind? You don't always go first.
Oh no, you go. You go. Okay. Okay, I'll go first. It's something that I'm very concerned with at the moment, because sometimes calls come to us and we find we need to move very quickly because the deadline is 6 weeks away, and then you can end up in quite sort of instrumental ways, just seeing who fits, who's available, what can we do. So I think one of the things that we're struggling with is how we can create these spaces in our very busy lives, and I'm talking, again, all of the things we do around caring and relationships outside work as well, which can just really, really constrain time. So how can we maintain conversations about our research that allow us to follow other people's research agendas, not just our own, and create spaces where more blue sky thinking can take place, and then, hey, if the call comes along, we're ready for it. And I think that, for me, is the biggest challenge at the moment. It's time, it's institutional pressures that we're all facing wherever we are. Everything's got to be done much more quickly for less money, with less time. And then the other difficulty we have is that opportunities to travel become restricted, sometimes again by money and by time, and sometimes it's there's other restrictions around things like border agency controls, which just mean that travelling is not a helpful or constructive opportunity for people as we'd hope. So I think what we need to be doing is making sure we can prioritise these spaces, that we actually recognise them, and we get our institutions to try and recognise them as absolutely critical to any future success for ourselves and for our colleagues. But for our colleagues, we need to be at the end of a Zoom call or a Teams call or whatever the mechanism is. We need to be there when it's not our priority as well. We need to be there when collaborators need us, and we need to be able to respond.
Thanks, Jude. So I'll use my moment to think beyond the institution. I mean, a network is much more than an institution. And at the end of the day, although the institutions might be the lifeboat to go down or something, it's actually the networks that'll still be there. Less and less of the sorts of collaborators and communities and students that I manage to work with, less and less of them have access to places like the University of Glasgow or any major large-scale research-intensive university in the world. So for just my 2 minutes, I'm going to just think beyond the institution and what's possible when we put that to the background a little bit, which is actually really liberating. So if you don't already do that, you should try it. It feels really good to step 1 foot outside of the institution. And I would say 2 things I'll say. One is imagination. I think we're limited by what we've experienced and what we know and who we know. And when we're working in international collaborations, you're reaching a really, really long way from anything you've experienced and from anybody's shoes you've stood in. And that takes a little bit of courage and imagination to try and build a bridge between 2 very, very different ways of knowing and being. And I say imagination, I come from an arts background. There are probably lots of other ways to build that bridge. But I think courage and imagination are part of it. Storytelling, listening, that kind of thing. Creative thinking beyond what is already well-oiled pathways of thought and practice in your own little world. And the second thing that's been really important in the work that I've been involved in for the past 10 years has been learning how to not hold the microphone, not be on a pedestal. The only reason I was ever invited into any of the spaces that enabled me to help build the Sustainable Futures Network was because I was a senior lecturer at the time at the University of Glasgow and came with a cloak and a business card and a microphone. And my colleagues and friends and I, we have to do a lot of work to put all that down. You still need to get invited, but then you have to put everything down and be the person who doesn't know in the room. And I'm not speaking about North and South or male or female. I think that just goes for everybody. To collaborate, you need to get comfortable with not knowing and being the one who's asking the silly questions or not really fully understanding, just not knowing. And I think that enables a sense of listening, a sense of inclusive knowledge, co-creation, And of all of the different sectors that we work across, it's hardest for academics because we spend hundreds of years becoming a master of something. So it's, of all of us, it's the hardest for us to say, oh yeah, I'm a master at this little thing, but for it to make any difference to the good, I have to be the novice amongst lots and lots of other places of mastery. So that's me.
I don't think I have that much to add, but following on from what you've both said is that creation, or the opportunity for creation, feels like it comes when there's trust. And that trust doesn't come overnight. Like, it's almost inevitable. It's been with long-standing relationships that then suddenly an opportunity arises, and then, you know, someone somewhere will have ideas, but they wouldn't necessarily be in a position to put things forward if we hadn't already got long-standing trusted relationships. And even over short time periods, through at least kind of really transparent and open sharing, those trusted relationships can be established. And I think it calls upon those of us who maybe do have, well, certainly have more access to opportunities, that we have to really recognise that and use every opportunity we can to be the best allies in terms of putting other people forward and sharing the opportunities that we see, and just really promoting and pushing others for steps that they might not otherwise take.
Thank you very much for the insightful points. Just to conclude, thank you. I would just like to re-echo the points made by Professor Adejoke and Professor Tayo Grace, as well as Professor Okeke, because they talked about the importance of community-based knowledge, recognizing community-based knowledge, as well as indigenous knowledge. So from my perspective, I would say also a move towards transdisciplinary learning, where you recognize the indigenous knowledge or even African-based research. Recognize it at the same level with the Western views, because they also have something to offer. So when that happens, that's when we actually come to true equity in learning and research. Also, mindset. Knowing that you are open to learn, that also helps, I believe, to build a true mutual learning context or situation or relationships. Okay, so I think at this point, I would open the floor to questions or comments.
What I wanted to contribute is that there should be research institutes in most African universities. For instance, the University of Ibadan has a research center called the University of Ibadan Research Center, which I happen to be a beneficiary. There, I was able to learn the skills that I'm currently using. There, I was exposed to networking. There, I was exposed to writing protocols. I didn't have difficulty getting my proposal and stuff to apply for my funding. I found it very easy because I was exposed. And luckily for me, the person that is assisting me is a lady, so different from other viewers. The only thing, the challenge is that most of them, when they want to assist you or probably mentor you, they want you to be around them. They don't want to send you out somewhere. And so when you're able to go out somewhere far away from them, they try to cut you off some things. I think that's the only challenge I have, because in that research center, I was exposed to a body known as the ARISE, African Research and Implementation Science Education Network, where we have so many countries from sub-Saharan Africa conducting research. And I was always the one like a licensing for the Nigerian team, which was headed by the University of Ibadan Research Center. So if those centers are established in most African universities and they allow the female ones to be able to participate, it was majorly of the PhD, but you just needed to know someone, either the PI, who will probably introduce you to the team. It's not actually something that is so made open. So if these things are done and made open, advertised, made available to so many female, it's going to help. And also, I want to also make a contribution to this particular thing that, okay, we keep saying that it's the men that is top there. we now that have the doctors, I'm not yet there, I'm not PhD third year student, but those that are not the doctors and the professors, what are you doing to change that same cycle from ongoing, like a repeated cycle? What are you doing? Are you having so many mentees that are female that can be able to look up to you, or do you just want to hold them to yourself? Can you actually have them and release them out to go? Because I was actually cut off from that network and I was doing very well, just because I was no longer in the institute. So I was cut off, but I had to get other connects. But I'm just like, it's a way that is actually not helping the early career researchers. If this can be done, I think it will help. Thank you.
So my question is just a school of thought, and then this is what I observe. Although things are getting better now, I noticed that sometimes when manuscript is being submitted from Africa, even when there's quality and standard known method is used, the acceptance rate is very, very low, especially if it's someone from Africa that is corresponding the work. Because sometimes we'll look at some journals and the kind of work that we read there, you just say that this is not quite different from the way we write and things that we submit. So I'm just bringing this up so that we can encourage equity among South-South networking and also collaboration and encouragement, because if one is observing this, I think it's not so. It can be emotional demoralizing. So that's just my observation, and I'm bringing it to this vote since something on research was discussed. Thank you very much.
If I understand the question or the comment, you're talking about challenges of publication, international publications from
exactly in
perspectives.
Q1 journal, the acceptance rates, especially when the corresponding author is from Africa.
Yeah. I completely am with you at that, and unfortunately I don't have the solution, but I do have a sort of proposition for you and for everyone in the room. I do a lot of work also in that sort of field. I've led a couple of international writing programs and work with quite a lot of journalism. And what I want to say is that it's an increasingly visible problem that increasing numbers of journals are aware of. The imbalance of the global imbalance of representation. And I'm usually quite cynical, but I'm quite optimistic that there are a lot of people who are really working in this space. And I would say to you, it's a very hard nut to crack, to try to be part of international publications, but retain situated use of the English language or the Spanish language, a situated sense of values and disciplinary definitions, that kind of thing. However, there is space for everybody here to actually put yourself on these editorial boards, because that's the main drawback of these spaces, is they don't have the sufficient representation within their editorial boards to come together to problem solve these things. So I can speak from my field in the social sciences, primarily education, sustainability, international development, that I sit on many editorial boards, and they sit around a bunch of people from the north worrying about this problem and trying to figure out how to overcome it. And they desperately need editorial members who come from different sorts of language bases and cultural bases to be part of that conversation. And so I think that you might find a lot of open doors if you put yourself in these spaces and don't fight the battle just by submitting manuscripts that will be troubled around and moved from editor to editor saying, I'm not sure what to do this because it kind of sounds differently than the other one, and actually be on the boards to have these conversations and shift the diversity of discourse that the publications go forward with.
A little bit. I mean, I agree, and I think there's a few quite simple things that can be done across different institutions. I mean, we can definitely offer affiliate status for alumni from institutions, and I think a lot of people it would be instinctive that the alumni should be kind of supported and are basically ambassadors for their institution.
Okay, there's a comment online. So it says, we also need to nominate Africa scholars to these editorial boards. Disproportionately fewer non-Northern scholars are invited. Actually, yes, you can nominate yourself.
Yeah, and you can ask to be nominated if you've got even if you've got a paper in review or if you've had a paper accepted or rejected, write back to the editors and say, could you please let me know when the editorial board is open again? Like, you can make yourself known in these places. Often it's through a conference circuit that you're in, a professional organization, a journal that you have experience with, or that you know somebody. It's networking, just like, it's networking. So there might be people here. We've heard one of the speakers was an editor of a journal. So we all know people, and you'll have people in this room that can put your name forward for places. Use your networks.
And in response to the question from the floor as well, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, I don't think we should use people in that way. If there are students effectively for life, apart from when they obviously supersede us and go off and do their own things and don't want us anymore. But those relationships are usually very deep and meaningful. And I can't think of a single PhD student that I've spent time with, or researcher, that I'm not still in contact with, or have refused to be in contact with. So I think, unfortunately, yours was just a very particular case. And I'm sorry, but yes, hopefully there's different institutions and different ways of working.
All right, thank you very much for the comments and answering the questions. So can we have a round of applause for the panelists?
Thank you so much. So I think that brings us to the end of our panel conversation. Please, can we give a round of applause to all our chairs, all our panel members, and all of you for staying this long. On behalf of the co-founders, Professor Tayo Grace from Babcock University, Ogun State in Nigeria, Professor Titilayo Fakeya from all the way from Ibadan, University of Ibadan, Professor Oyewumi Adejoke all the way from Lagos. We really appreciate you for coming all the way. They just come just for this event, for all the way. So thank you so much.